All right. Hello and welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Here we're staying with religion and religious history. Stephen writes, "This might be a bit of a ramble here to give you the context, but essentially my question is this. Christians/Judeo-Christians/Jordan Peterson make the argument that Christianity serves as a much-needed restraint against the passions and violence and out-of-controlness of the ancient gods or paganism. I have heard this argument many times when I was a Christian. Before Christ, everything was savagery and chaos. Is that true? If not entirely, is there truth to it? Is Christianity really necessary to have a peaceful society? And is paganism really just bloodlust and mindless aggression?" And then he links to a video that was inspiration behind the question. That was Jordan Peterson in his Exodus series, talking to a bunch of religious scholars and historians about the Nazis and about how Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust might have been an expression of latent pagan feelings after the Christianity and Lutheranism of Germany sort of took a back seat. Never mind the Pope's support for the Nazi Party during some of that time. So the first thing I would say with a question like this is that, and here I'm going to speak less about religion to start with and more about philosophy and logic. You have to be aware and be careful of concept swapping. Now, depending on the context and the way the argument is made, sometimes this is called equivocation. Sometimes it's called a Mott and Bailey argument. But and I don't think what Jordan Peterson is almost saying here, but certainly implying, and many, many other people do make this argument explicitly, it is using two different concepts interchangeably as if they are equivalent. And here I think the danger of equivocation or concept swapping is between paganism and non-Christianity, or the absence of Christianity. And it's implied that the absence of Christianity is in some sense synonymous with paganism. This is not true, first of all. And it's like the entire nature of the argument being presented, which is that you need Christianity in order to have civilization. It sort of hinges upon that equivocation, which becomes really silly when you look at civilizations like Egypt or ancient China that managed a great deal of civility and technological expansion and accomplishment far prior to Christianity. So in the video, I think it's Dennis Prager, along with a few other guys that Peterson's talking with. But paganism is sort of loosely grouped in with godless atheism. And I'm going to chalk it up to Peterson getting carried away with himself, because he's normally not that careless, given his otherwise, his respect for people like Nietzsche, who and Nietzsche's tremendous respect for the Greeks and Greek paganism. That this was a weird and unusual slip on his part, but maybe not so unusual if you subscribe to Vox Day. So let's address the points and in the question. Was the past just savagery and chaos prior to Christianity, and then Christianity civilized things? I mean, the short answer is just no. There was barbarism and chaos. But there was also barbarism and chaos after Christianity in many places. And there was also civilization prior to Christianity. Now, is there truth to the claim? What you can say about Christianity is that Christianity does offer what I'm going to call a civilization formula. I was just diving into the idea of a political formula from the Italian school of political theory, and the idea that you need a story that legitimizes power, that legitimizes the ruling class and their authority. And I think you would say that civilization requires a civilization formula, a story, and I'm going to define a civilization formula as a story or system that resolves the blood feud. Because the blood feud is the great problem for human civility. How do you deal with the cycles of violence that emerge when one wronged party takes it upon themselves to correct that wrong and to avenge themselves maybe more than the wronging party feels is justified, which is of course subjective, and each party is going to judge it from their own perspective, and so you end up with cycles of abuse that spiral out of control and basically create instability that makes, more developed societies not possible. Now, Christianity is not the only civilization formula. It's not even the only civilization formula in the West. It's not the first civilization formula in the West. I would say that Western civilization, and here we're excluding Sumeria and Egypt and the other Near East stuff as slightly different peoples with a different sort of feeling and a different history, although we are connected to that to some degree. But I would say the origin of the Western civilization formula comes in a very primordial state from the Iliad, and is depicted in a kind of dream form on the shield of Achilles. But we see that really fleshed out with Aeschylus in the Oresteia. In the last play of the Oresteia, which is the story of an intrafamilial cycle of violence. So, Agamemnon kills his daughter Iphigenia. He comes home from Troy after sacrificing his daughter. Wife has not forgiven him. Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon. And then Agamemnon's and Clytemnestra's son Orestes then kills his own mother in turn. Mother's ghost wakes up the Furies, the Erinnues. These are ancient spirits of vengeance. Not the normal gods, worth mentioning. They're closer to Titans. They're older than the gods. And they pursue Orestes. And Orestes eventually takes refuge in a temple of Apollo. Apollo being the one who had urged him to take vengeance in the first place. And Athena intervenes and makes a deal with the Furies. She says, I'll tell you what, the justice that you seek is not real justice. Athena, can give you real justice. And if you, bind yourself to accept the justice I will offer, whether you like it or not, I will give you a special honored place in the city that I build. And you will be, revered, and but you must put away your bloodlust. You must put away your desire for vengeance, and accept the honor that we give you in spirit. And the Furies kind of accept this, not really sure what to make of it, the whole thing, but they accept it. And Athena's justice is a trial. It's the first trial ever. 13 jurors, just like we have today. And they put Orestes on trial for matricide. And Athena herself is the 13th juror. And after some deliberation and the arguments, the jury decides 7-6, very close, but they decide that Orestes is not guilty, and so he is free. And the Furies are not happy about this, but they are bound by their acceptance of Athena's promise. And so they are transformed from Furies, Erinnues, to Eumenides, those of good intentions, which is the title of the third part of this trilogy, Eumenides. It's the story of the transformation of justice from vengeance, which was what justice meant, really, prior to that. It was not some high-minded, virtuous thing. Justice was something to be feared, respected, feared, and avoided if possible by, so as to not invoke these extremely dangerous spirits into something positive, into something civic. And it's not exactly clear what justice is, according to Athena, but it's a lot more, and it's not made any more clear by Plato's Republic, which is an exploration of justice. But it is something positive, and it is something afforded by and to those of good intentions. So that's a pre-Christian civilization formula for ending blood feuds, and you see the sort of the mechanism in the jury. We're going to defer the authority of vengeance, which is necessary for human psychology, to a more objective third party. We're going to give up this authority, and it comes at a bit of a price, but we think that price is worth it, and now civilization is possible. So Christianity actually builds from this. Christianity inherits heroic idealism from the Greek tradition, the idea that immortality is possible through the word. Also from the Iliad. And the Iliad has so many Christian themes, it's almost hard to list, but I've gone over those in a number of other places, including this book on the hero and the man. So that there's a lot there's a lot that Christianity draws from in its ability to ground civilization. But if we could explain briefly, how does Christianity actually operate mechanistically as a civilization formula? It's fairly simple. It grounds all meaning and value in the hereafter, in the afterlife. And 2, it makes forgiveness a divine virtue. Not just a divine virtue, because it is a quality of God. God is all merciful. But 2, it makes forgiveness a divine virtue. But 3, it ties eternal life for the believer to forgiveness. The Lord's Prayer says, and forgive others their trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In other words, our salvation as mortals is contingent, in fact, upon forgiveness of others. Now, when you ground all meaning and value in the hereafter, that actually takes away a lot of the motivation and impetus for revenge in the first place. Because how can someone else harm you? How could someone else take away your eternal life unless they lure you into sin? But that's kind of on you, But in case that isn't enough, it makes forgiveness a divine virtue. So, and again, ties your immortality, your time with God in the afterlife, to forgiveness of others. Solves blood feuds quite well. And we see this historically. It does work. Which is not to say that there isn't barbarism and chaos of other kinds. You have, a degree of nastiness in the Inquisitions and some witch hunting, which tend to be a little exaggerated. They're not as bad as leftists like to make them out to be. But, not great either. And you had some silliness, some really, really tragic but also hilarious silliness with like the Fourth Crusade and the Children's Crusade. You know, is that negating the civilization involved? I don't think so. But in the context where, certain Christian religious scholars want to point to, barbarism and chaos prior to Christianity and say that negates the civilization of that time, rhetorically speaking, I'm tempted to say turnabout is fair play, but that's not very philosophical of me. So, anyways, the Christianity does work as a civilization formula, but again, Christianity is not the only civilization formula. You have, the Greeks I just described. You have the Egyptians, the Chinese, and since Jordan Peterson and these guys are talking about the Germans, let's talk about the Germans. I have this book called The Common Law by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the more respected and important jurists of the last century, really. And he, in his book about the history of the common law, he has this to say. First subject to be discussed is general liability, civil and criminal. Here we go. It is commonly known that the early forms of legal procedure were grounded in vengeance. So we're going back to those furies here. Modern writers have thought the Roman law started from the blood feud, and all authorities agree that the German law begun in that way. The feud led to the composition, at first optional, then compulsory, by which the feud was bought off. So he's talking about the blood price, and this was depicted on the Shield of Achilles as well. The gradual encroachment of the composition may be traced in the Anglo-Saxon laws, and the feud was pretty well broken up, though not extinguished, by the time of William the Conqueror. The killings and house burnings of an earlier day became the appeals of mayhem and arson, and so on and so forth. So, in the context of describing the origins of the common law, we're talking about Germanic law that began prior to Christianity resolving blood feuds. In other words, we have a different civilization formula in Germany, where we're talking about Nazis and so forth, prior to Christianity. And the English common law tradition, which the United States has inherited to a great degree, came from that. It came from the Germans were denouncing. Like, should they ever, I think it's Prager or some Prager-sounding guy says, he quotes this Heinrich Heine character who says, basically, if the Germans ever lost the cross, if they ever gave up the cross, they would descend back into their, Odinic bloodlust and their love of war. And it's like, but that's not what is being described historically. What's being described historically is the Germans coming to their own sort of institutional model for overcoming blood feuds in the way that every other people on the planet want to overcome blood feuds. And in fact, our model in the Anglosphere comes from the Germans, back before they migrated across the Channel. So, it's worth mentioning too that like Nazi occult paganism isn't representative of paganism generally. Not just because they're occultists and weird, Gnostics in some regard. They've got kind of a Hegelian view in some ways, but they're not even representative of German paganism historically. They are less representative of paganism as a branch than the Fourth Crusade represents Christianity, and that's because the Nazi and the 19th and 20th century notions of Germanic paganism are largely reconstructed. There was a break in the tradition of from paganism at the time when the common law was being, created through the Germanic moots. What caused that break? It was Christianity. Christianity broke paganism. It burned the temples. It excommunicated people. If you read Orkneyinga saga, they converted some of these islands at sword point. Literally taking, some lord's noble son, holding him at the sword to his throat and saying, if you convert or else. And so they did. Now, that wasn't how Christianity spread everywhere, but paganism was largely put to the sword by Christianity. And so, when people who are dissatisfied with Christianity and what Christianity is unable to do in the eyes of people in the, early 20th century, try to reconnect with, paganism in a reconstructive fashion. That's going to be a very, very, you would expect that to be an extremely poor representation of what was actually believed prior to that. One, because it's reconstructed, and two, because they're motivated more by a desire to break with Christianity than they are in, doing paganism well. That's why they're taking paganism in the first place. Their desire to break from the default is shaping their view of what the alternative must be. And that's a serious, mental and psychological hurdle that people have to contend with in all kinds of contexts. But it's especially powerful in religion, I would say. Now, Peterson does sort of indirectly quote Jung and say that maybe the spirit of Odin is at work in the Nazi party. And there might actually be some truth to that. There is a book by Chris Kershaw that says that Odin is much older than his adopted primacy might suggest. Odin is a very late god in the German pantheon. He is not the chief god in most cases. That's Thor. Odin sort of becomes the main god due to Snorri and some Christian poets that came later, and there was some politics involved because Odin was related to kings and the legitimacy of kings, and so they make him a chief god for political reasons. But that doesn't mean that Odin isn't necessarily an old god in some sense. And Chris Kershaw makes the point that Odin might be the leader of the Einherjar, a sort of primitive Ur-Korios, which is like a war band of young men and raiders from the Indo-European steppe. So very, very old god that instigates conflict in interesting ways. He's not exactly a god of war in the way that Mars or Ares is, but he has some interesting crossovers, possibly. He's closer to Hermes as a god of transition, and so that war band, I think, marks a period of transition from young men as they transition from boys into men. But then they leave that Korios and they rejoin society later. So very complicated, and I'm granting there could be a possibility of truth to the claim that Odin might have some spiritual connection there. But again, Odin was not the main god. What Jordan Peterson and these religious scholars are talking about with civilization is a kind of balance and a moving away from the extremes. What do you have in a pagan pantheon of many gods if not balance? And also, it's worth mentioning, not all these gods are psychological projections in the way that Jung sort of describes them. Thor is literally the sky. He is very similar to the Mongolian Tengri, the expansive blue, forehead of is his. I'm mixing up the description here, but the expansive blue sky is considered his forehead. He is the sky itself. It's not a psychological projection, but an anthropomorphization of the physical world. And then you have these other deities like Freyr and Tyr, Frigg, Balder, so forth. These are like taking account of and giving respect to all of these different deities, in tension with each other sometimes, but trying to balance that is not a recipe for extremity. And most, again, it's hard to classify all of paganism in one fell swoop, because paganism is almost by definition a general term for religions of local custom. So they are going to vary widely by definition. But and to speak of paganism as having a bloodlust and chaotic characters it's almost a category error. But it's it's to whatever degree you can speak of polytheistic paganism in Germany or in Greece for that matter, which is relevant, especially when we're talking about Christianity, which borrowed a lot from that tradition. I think it's closer to being outright false than it is even to being a category error. It's saying paganism is mindless aggression is it's equivalent to saying monotheism is just nihilistic detachment. That's almost more true, because at least monotheism has a character in a way that paganism doesn't, or has significantly less so. But does Christianity bring civilization? Let me read a few Bible verses to you and tell me if these seem balanced and civilized. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. This is Luke 14:26. That seems pretty extreme to me. It seemed pretty extreme when I wrote Holy Nihilism, which sort of addresses this, the point of Christianity, and the whole reason I wrote that book was that there is this whole class of people who I feel like are represented in this little circle, and by Jordan Peterson in particular among them, who are themselves not believing Christians, but who don't like the trajectory of the modern age, and say, well, what can save the world that I like? What can save the civilization and the good things in this world? Maybe Christianity will save this for me. And if you dig into Christianity at all, it's not about that at all. To me, the nature of Christianity can be distilled from one verse in Matthew. And I mean, to me, it's the best verse in this regard, because it's Jesus telling it directly what he is all about. And the verse goes like this. One of the Sadducees comes up to him. I'll just read the verse. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And this is Matthew 22:35-40. So, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. That's pretty extreme, I would say. Not balanced. Maybe good if you accept the Christian worldview. It makes sense to do that. But like as I said, it grounds everything in the hereafter. And so if God is offering you eternal life on the other side of this mortal coil, that is what you should love with all your heart, all your mind, and all your strength. You know. But this extremity is not, what the balanced, curbing of the passions that these people are talking about. And you can see this in the fruits of the spirits line from Galatians. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such things there is no law. And, often neglected follow-up verse, it says, and they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. That's a pretty big line and a pretty big call. You're to put your body and your flesh and your attachments to the flesh to death. And this is the meaning of hate your father and mother, wife and children. Does it mean hate them literally? No, but it does mean put to death your connections to this in this world that are grounded in this world and in the flesh. And if that's not explicit enough, if that's not, I'll give you one more. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. 1 John 2:15-17. Christianity is not about saving civilization. People who think that Christianity will save civilization are still caught in the mindset of the flesh that Christianity is telling them to abandon. No one who is trying to make this point is speaking from a place of Christian spirituality. They're speaking from attachment to the world and to the flesh and to physical goods. And I'm going to read one more passage. I know I'm going over time a little bit, but from one of the greatest authors, Christian authors, to write on this. And that is, of course, St. Augustine in the City of God. Now, Augustine at the time of writing this was having to defend Christianity from a bunch of... Rome had already converted to Christianity at this time. But after getting sacked by the Goths in 399, I want to say, a lot of people were saying, well, maybe we should go back to paganism. This Christianity thing doesn't seem to be working out very well. And listen to what Augustine has to say here. He says, the saints lose nothing by being deprived of temporal goods. After giving proper attention and consideration to these points, observe whether any disaster has happened to the faithful and religious, which did not turn out for their good, unless we are to suppose that there is no meaning in the apostle's statement, we know that God makes all things cooperate for good for those who love him. They lost all they had. Did they lose faith, or devotion, or the possessions of the inner man who is rich in the sight of God? These are the riches of Christians, and the apostle, who is endowed with this wealth, said, devotion combined with self-sufficiency yields great profit, for we brought nothing into this world, and we cannot take away anything with us. So if we have food and clothes, we are content with that. For those who wish to become rich fall into temptation, and into a snare, and into many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into death and destruction. For acquisitiveness is the root of all evils, and those who have this as their aim have strayed away from the faith and have entangled themselves in many sorrows. If those who lost their earthly riches in that disaster had possessed them in the spirit, thus described to them by the one who was outwardly poor but inwardly rich, that is, if they had used the world as though not using it, then they would have been able to say with that man who was sorely tried and yet never overcome, I issued from my mother's womb in nakedness I shall return to the earth. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, it has happened as God decided, may the Lord's name be blessed. Thus a good servant would regard the will of God as his great resource, and he would be enriched in his mind by close attendance on God's will, nor would he grieve if deprived in life of those possessions which he would soon have to leave behind at his death. So there's your Christian concern for civilization. And it may be said, well, Christianity did achieve this civilization. Yes, in Europe. What about in Africa? What about in Latin America or Southeast Asia? Rwanda was the most Christian country in Africa at the time of the genocide. It's worth remembering. So I think the adoration of Jordan B. Peterson types for Christianity comes from a fundamentally not a Christian spirit, but also from a misguided hope that Christianity will in some sense save the West. Christianity has no attachment to this world. It does not share that desire, and it could not care less about whether Western civilization survives or not. Now, accomplishing ending blood feuds is an accomplishment. It's good, but as far as what comes after that, and whether other people are going to blood feud you or avenge you or take your stuff is a completely other question. And in point of fact, many serious secular historians, including the first great Roman historian, Edward Gibbon, believe that Christianity may have in fact been in some sense responsible for the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization, from which the West did not recover in standard of living for 1,000 years. And that, stagnancy was also all under Christianity. And yes, the Byzantines managed all right, but they were nothing compared to what Rome had been prior to Christianity. So, hope that answers the questions here. They're annoyingly common, but I think they're completely wrong-minded historically, factually, and also spiritually. So, thanks for listening.